Welcome to Who Shot Ya?
I'm Omar Bradley, the former mayor of Compton,
And I'm Michael Carlin, author and documentary filmmaker.
So where are we now, Mike, in our trilogy of investigation on the murders of Tupac and Biggie?
Well, it was an interesting week. I was in Century City, and Mayor Eric Garcetti came through. And of course, because of what happened in Las Vegas on Sunday, and this was, I can't remember whether it was Tuesday or Wednesday because the days all kind of ran together this week for me. But there were about 300 police officers that showed up at this press release because they were afraid that there was going to be an active shooter shooting down into the press conference inside the mall in Century City. So they moved the press conference to a place where we couldn't see any building. And that's where they decided to do the press conference. But security was extremely tight. And Eric Garcetti gets up and talks about the 70 police officers and LA Fire Department personnel that were at the concert in Las Vegas, off duty, working, doing side work at that concert.
That's interesting because it certainly demonstrates a pattern of Los Angeles police being involved in the music industry, and specifically in the music industry where it transverses the interests of Las Vegas, Nevada.
Yeah. And you think about one of the biggest resources for Las Vegas is Los Angeles. And, you know, when they need extra personnel, where do they go to? They don't have them in Las Vegas. They have to get them from here. And so you walk that back to the Tupac Biggie era, and it just makes sense that there were police working off duty in Las Vegas the night Tupac was murdered.
What do you make of the fact that a lone gunman shot how many? 78 people? Killed 78 people by a gunshot wound, wounded almost 600, and was dead before, let's say, the 30th minute after he began that operation. And a killer who shot probably the most noteworthy hip-hop artist of his time, who after 20 years has not been caught.
Yeah, and Las Vegas in many ways is the exact same today as it was back then, with cameras everywhere. And you would think that the most famous rapper of all history, you would think that that would be a murder that they would want to solve. And there were literally hundreds of witnesses, and yet it's not solved.
Well, that kind of analysis would have to operate on multiple levels. I mean, first you got to ask, what if Tupac was white? What if Elvis Presley was shot in the exact same area where Tupac was shot after an incident similar to the one that occurred before he was shot? What if that person was a well-known white actor or comedian or philanthropist? Would the response by the Las Vegas police be the same?
I don't think so.
So that could be one of the reasons why we don't have a killer. Because I'm not saying I know this to be true. I'm saying historically I know it is true that African American superstars are not venerated, nor do they receive the same kind of treatment as do white superstars. Robert Downey Jr. is a perfect example. He's got more arrests than Carter has pills, but he's able to leave jail and go shoot a movie. Wesley Snipes, on the other hand, had one conviction, offered to pay whatever he owed the IRS prior to trial even beginning, and was given the maximum. for his role in income tax evasion. So that's something that could be looked at. I mean, maybe, society just didn't care about this African-American male who had views that were very dissimilar from the average American.
I reached out to the Las Vegas police because we had the confession letter, and I thought it was, somebody had to do the right thing and actually reach out and see if we couldn't get some traction. And they told me that because Tupac said "fuck you" to a police officer, that they didn't feel they needed to solve this case.
Huh.
And what's crazy about that is I didn't realize police got to pick and choose which cases they wanted to work on and solve and which ones they didn't.
Well, I don't think they get to pick or choose either, but I know they do pick or choose which ones they're going to give maximum effort to and which ones they're going to give window treatment kind of investigation to. I mean, everything is right around the periphery, but never anything solid to bring justice forth, especially on behalf of a young African American male, and most definitely on behalf of somebody who was the epitome of the young African male as an image of a thug, that image being positive in certain communities and negatives in others. So I think everything happened as it should have happened historically. Historically, black people are murdered. White police officers don't give a damn. There are some that give a damn, but the mere fact that there are still some who are operating in police uniforms who don't care if a black person is deprived of their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but rather inflames their own sensibilities because they say, oh, this guy wouldn't stand up at the playing of the national anthem. It kind of suggests that, there are two Americas still. And Tupac could have been a victim of the two America mentality. One black, one white, one rich, one poor. The other thing is that the media had devalued Tupac's life to a great degree. They had made him something that he was not. Tupac was not a gangster. Tupac was born of parentage that was civil rights activists and Black Power movement activists, people who taught cooperation between the other races, but most definitely between our own. So I don't see that either. What I do see is people who are close to police and understand the police mentality and understand what that mentality will do to protect other cops.
Well, let's go back to the beginning of Tupac. He gets called out on the pulpit by Dan Quayle and becomes famous. And he's famous because his music was used, and this is the allegation that Dan Quayle made, and it comes from a Texas DPS officer that was murdered in Texas. And supposedly it was a Tupac song that the killer was playing when he murdered the DPS officer. And so Tupac is labeled a cop killer. And Tupac goes to Atlanta and gets in the middle of some beef that's going on where a black man has been pulled over by two cops. Two cops aren't even, they're not even on duty. And Tupac gets in the middle and says, why are you hassling this guy? And then as these cops are walking away, they had evidently busted Tupac's window in the car he was in. So Tupac pulls out his gun and shoots them. He shoots them both in the butt. So it wasn't life-threatening, but I'm sure they weren't happy. And then Tupac's arrested, but they find out the cops are drunk and disorderly, and they possess guns that have been stolen from an evidence locker. You've never heard that before, have you? Guns stolen from an evidence locker? And so that entire case goes away, but now Tupac is labeled a cop killer.
And we don't have to do a great deal of investigation to know that the image of the police is synonymous with the image of America. So if you are anti-American, you are automatically anti-police.
Yes.
And once you are targeted and selected to be a voice for the oppressed and the downtrodden, you can just about guess that you're going to have some police issues. You're going to be confronted by the police. You're going to be pulled over by the police. They're going to knock a tail light out. They're going to help knock a bumper off and then say, hey, I'm stopping you because your tail light is off or your bumper's missing.
So if you even then look at Tupac's case, where he catches a case for rape
Mm-hmm.
in a room in which he wasn't in when the rape occurred, he was in another room sleeping, and he gets convicted of having touched this woman's buttocks. That was the conviction. And the same police that showed up at the Quad studio shooting are the ones that show up to arrest him. Doesn't that sound similar to Suge's current case?
Sounds very similar. The question is, what is the motivation for the police to move in the manner that they do or did around people like Tupac, people like Suge Knight? Are they doing that because you said F the police? Or are they doing that because the vice president says, I'm familiar with Tupac Shakur, and here's a man who is not fit to live in our society? Well, what are you going to do but kill him?
Well, okay. So then you have Tupac. After he goes to prison, he comes out and he goes to work for the Cop record label. And none of the cops will bodyguard for Tupac.
Interesting.
I mean, doesn't this look like Tupac is being targeted?
Yes.
Because what if Tupac was able to actually develop a following, do good things, get people behind him, and what he wasn't at 25, he could have become at 45. He could have been one of the most amazing leaders that ever existed. And that had to drive fear into the hearts of power structures.
Are the police self-motivated if they are implicated in the killing of Tupac? Or is there an external motivation? And what would it be motivated by? You know, in my opinion, Tupac was dangerous because he opened the door for alternative thinking for African Americans. When I grew up, we all had the same haircut. Black kids. We all wore the same tennis shoes. We all saluted the flag. We all thought the same thing. Tupac was a different breed. His notions of fair play were not like mine. And definitely what he valued in society was different from what I valued. Yet still, I'm hurt by his murder because it suggests that if you want someone who's controversial, who happens to be black, wiped off the face of the earth, you just do it, call it gang-related, and move on.
Well, and there were many murders that happened with death row or surrounding death row records that basically got cleared by saying, hey, it's a gang thing. And they moved on, and they didn't feel, and when I say they, I'm talking about the police. The police did not feel like they needed to actually solve something that was a quote-unquote gang thing.
They could still offer an opinion as to how it happened, why it happened, and who could have made it happen.
And in many of those cases, and in fact, one case is Bobby Finch. I sent a FOIA request to the sheriffs because I wanted to get new information, or whatever information they have on this case as to where they're at with this murder. It's unsolved. It's 21 years ago. And I get a letter saying, oh, this is an ongoing investigation, so we can't provide you with any information. Not an incident report, nothing. I got nothing from the sheriffs 20 years later.
And isn't it interesting that the police or the DA or the FBI has a panoply of excuses for why you can't know the truth that they have in their possession?
Well, and I think we're seeing that with this Las Vegas shooting right now. They have videotape from inside the casino that we're not getting a chance to look at. They have the note that the killer supposedly wrote. We don't get to see that. We don't get to see so much of the information in this murder investigation because they just don't want us to know.
Is it that they don't want you to know, or is it that they don't want you to know who is the real force behind the actions that led up to the murder of Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls?
Well, I think it's one thing that's interesting is the number of shows that have come out recently and the amount of interest in the Tupac murder. And one show in particular is coming out, it's unsolved. It's going to be on USA Cable, which just coincidentally happens to be owned by Universal, and Universal is the company that released Tupac Shakur's music. And so you just have to wonder, what is the fear that they have that they're actually trying to obfuscate the truth and put out a false narrative about Tupac's murder?
I don't know. I mean, I think we can only develop hierarchies of motivations and say that the motivation that produced the most money or protected the most money or protected the loss of the most money would be the highest order of thinking, because America's a capitalist society. And so if we're going to look for any reasons why people like Tupac or Biggie or Michael Jackson or others are murdered, we need to understand at what level our society goes from friendly engagement to this American actor or player to war against that same individual. I may have to go to war with you because something you said or someone you knows or something you saw is dangerous to what I'm doing. It's a conflict with me. And while maybe you don't understand you're having a conflict with me, I understand it, and that's good enough.
Well, when you look at Tupac, I mean, we've talked about this before. He signs with Interscope. Ted Field is the one that his daughter says to him, you have to sign this young rapper. He then becomes famous because of Dan Quayle. Tupac never receives the money that he was due in any of these albums that he released. And then the minute he starts screaming audit, he gets murdered.
Well, now you're touching on other people's interests. It's one thing for Omar Bradley to cry wolf and point to a police officer and say, hey, that's the problem. It's quite another thing when an international superstar says it.
Yeah. And when he's dating Quincy Jones' daughter, and Quincy Jones is opening up all of Hollywood to him, And now he's going to have attorneys, he's going to have accountants, he's going to have agents, he's going to have managers, and they're all going to be looking into this nefarious company that is not paying Tupac. That's probably not going to be a good situation. And now we have a company that's known as the Cop record label, where none of the cops will guard Tupac. So this is a really bad situation for Tupac on September the 7th, 1996.
That's because someone understands that there is a higher power in operation, and anybody who gets involved with this is going to lose. You know, in ancient Egypt, and of course we use the word Egypt because that's what the Greeks called it, but in Kemet Nu, when there was a plot against Pharaoh, the plotters would kill the actual murderers, the planners of the murders, and even many other conspirators to make sure that when the murder took place, they were protected. And then they would kill the murderers that killed all of those other folks. They would kill back 4 generations to protect the information of who they were and what their purposes were. And of course, the greatest purpose on earth is not money, it's power.
Yeah, power leads to money. Money doesn't always lead to power.
So Tupac, his murder and his death, if it had a political motivation, could have simply been a sacrifice to silence the notion that young boys can grow up and operate outside the lines that have been drawn. That would suggest that no matter what you do to prove whether there were police officers involved, whether there was a police department that was involved, or whether or not there were DAs involved, you're going to lose. Why? Because you're going to need those same agencies to prove you're telling the truth. And why should I tell on me for you, or tell on my friends or my colleagues? So I think, after reading the documents that you shared with me about the federal lawsuit brought by Biggie's mother and his wife, baby's mama, and the fact that most of it that had any teeth to it was dismissed before the trial ever began, suggests that even judges can be persuaded to see things from a rose-colored lens in order not to see things from a black eye.
You know, recently I've spent quite a bit of time in China, and one of the things about doing business in China is there is no functioning court system over there. And I wonder if knowing that you're not going to have a functioning court system is better than thinking you're going to have a functioning court system here. And knowing now, having you've been through the court system, that maybe that this doesn't really exist.
Anything that interferes or intersects with politics on any level, be it elections, be it political party, be it capacity to promote through a department, is tainted. And I would estimate, and my defense attorney estimated, that the DA's office spent $4 million prosecute me over 6,000. So clearly, it's not money.
I just had a wrongful death case sent to me, and 2 of the jurors that rendered the verdict that the hospital wasn't liable turned out to be married to people that worked at the hospital.
This is not an unusual set of circumstances, and once again, the folks who would investigate jurors are prosecutors, or for the prosecutor's office. The ones that would focus on judges, they would be prosecutors. And most judges are former prosecutors. So when you walk into a court of law, if you're the topic, you're in big trouble. Because first of all, if you were a part of that system, more than likely you would not go to court. And if what has occurred that brought you there was so overt that it exposed a member of the court system, then whatever trial you go through will simply be a Shakespearean act. But the outcome will be obvious. The court is going to protect its players. It's going to protect them. The courts are going to protect the police. They're going to protect the DAs. They're going to protect the investigators. It's going to do that because it is one system that really is composed for no other reason but to adjudicate, to adjudge what is right or wrong, good or bad, from the standpoint of the system. So when you see a federal lawsuit that alleged that the 14th Amendment rights of Christopher Wallace was abridged, that deprivation of the capacity of his wife, Faith Evans, to enjoy his life, the pursuit of happiness, all of those things happen. And everything alleged in there happened. But did it matter to the system?
No. That case, when you look at the documents, is provable beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a higher standard than what the civil case would be held to. And yet, that still got dismissed. It still got pushed out. The first one, the first Wallace civil trial, got pushed out because an LAPD officer had withheld evidence from the plaintiffs in the case, and the judge declared a mistrial. And when you read the documents that were withheld, those were all documents that basically pointed to the fact that LA, the city, and LAPD, the police, were involved in that murder. And so all of those documents had been withheld. The second trial gets pushed out because they just realized that this was too big of a number and it was going to have too bad of an outcome for the city. And so they just decided we gotta push this thing out of the court system.
And replace the political actors who would have insisted that the matter was important and should have been adjudicated to a conclusion out of the system as well. Because if you look at, the politics of Los Angeles, the people who were there and who were holding the cards then are completely gone from the system and the capacities that they were in. So no one is immune from the sway of power by certain players who want to keep things under wrap. The politicians are not immune, they can be removed. The judges can be removed. The police can be removed. And even the gangsters can be removed. I mean, they can remove the gangsters by terminating their life or terminating their freedom. So no one is immune when you're talking about whether or not a system has acted on its own behalf and in its own defense to protect itself from the ugly truth of what it's done or what some of its underlings have done. And as we keep searching for a truth as to who would have the motivation, who would have the capacity, and then who would have the power to do such a thing, to kill two bright young stars and then wipe it away. I mean, I've always believe that certainly this thing went well above the LAPD, well above the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. I think you'll find evidence of their complicity, but I think the actual shot caller was probably on a federal level or above.
Well, it certainly does start to point in that direction when we start to look at it in context of everything that was going on in Los Angeles, in Death Row Records, and in the music industry.
Well, if I want to push crack throughout certain parts of Los Angeles, certain parts of Chicago, certain parts of New York, certain parts of Philadelphia, when we say certain parts, we know we mean those parts of black folks.
And that was the agenda. The agenda was to destroy the black family and raise money for covert activities.
I think the byproduct was to raise money for covert activities. I think the actual purpose was to destroy any remnant of hope, any historical memory of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and the people who were stalwart players in those movements. And certainly, you know, when you look at the murder of Huey P. Newton, he succumbed to the crack gang. But from what I understand, he was processing himself to become a member of the Nation of Islam and seeking refuge there in order to rehabilitate himself from crack. But his law professor was Ed Meese. I mean, you know what I mean? All
Sure.
of the notions of give me liberty and give me death that he got from players in the system. Some of the people who were members of the Nation of Islam were Ford Foundation fellows. And as we know, the Ford Foundation was a major contributor to the Nazi Party. And so the system has a long record of controlling even the people who rail against the system.
Well, Prescott Bush was the banker for the Nazi Party. I mean, we don't have to look too far to find power structures that would have a vested interest in seeing these two amazing young men wiped from the face of the earth.
And so why are you and I sitting here talking about it and getting ready to put it on YouTube?
Well, I think we're seeking the truth. And one thing that I've come to believe about this case, that is, if we want the case of Tupac Shakur solved, then we have to look at the Biggie case, because the Biggie case has more compelling evidence that will lead to solving the Tupac case. Not saying we shouldn't look at the Tupac case, because we should, but Vegas holds the bulk of the information, and it's never going to be released to us.
Well, in a scenario where you don't have all the facts, although the facts are dancing around the room like an elephant, you can only draw certain conclusions based on facts. These things are known as hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
Clearly, after 3 weeks of looking at motive, opportunity, and then the power to make something like this happen, there has to be some complicity by the government. Just no other way. Now, which government, we don't know.
Well, and when we say government, you know, it's not like there's just some vanilla generic government out there. Our government is set up where there are factions that are constantly fighting inside the government to do all sorts of things. And so we're talking probably about some kind of a cross-section of the government that definitely wanted this to happen and were complicit. It doesn't mean that every single facet of the government knew about it and were part of it.
You know, right before he died, Dick Gregory began to reveal certain facts about the assassination of Malcolm X. He began to say that, well, the Audubon Ballroom where Malcolm X was killed was visited on multiple occasions leading up to the assassination by the CIA. He began to reveal that the actual autopsy report showed that Malcolm was being shot not at eye level, but from
An elevated
an
position.
elevated position, which would mean that the four guys on the movie and the four guys that they said were shooting in the middle of the Audubon were probably not the killers. In fact, Dick Gregory even alleged that the guys that were supposedly the killers had blanks in their guns. And so, just think if something like that is true, then we have a scenario where a local player, even though Malcolm had national and international acclaim, but he was a local player, he was a New York phenomenon, can rise to the level, his rhetoric can rise to the level of sensitivity where it begins to disrupt the comfort level of people who are charged with keeping a blindfold over the masses. Let me give you an example, and we'll try to say why this relates to Biggie and Tupac. African Americans die in the hundreds of thousands each year from diabetes, complications from diabetes. Hundreds of thousands. A doctor and researcher challenged the notion that diabetes is somehow genetically transferred from one African American to the next by going back to Africa and looking at reported cases of diabetes. And the Africans had the lowest level of diabetes on the planet. Hence, it can't be a genetic transference, because if it was, it would certainly come from the original Africans. She opined that, of course, it's the diet, and more importantly, that much of the milk that comes to the African American community comes from dairy ranchers who are located near nuclear facilities. Whether that is a targeted operation or whether it just happens by happenstance, she didn't really have the facts. That was an allegation she brought. Now, why is that significant? There have been some of the biggest marches that I have seen in the last 5, 10, 15 years about one black man or 3 black men being shot by the police. And rightfully so. With 200,000 and 300,000 African Americans dying every year from diabetes, no black people are marching or even rallying or having conversations about it, because we look at this 5, 6, maybe 100 police-involved shootings of blacks that are questionable, and we are almost forcefully honed into these events by the media, where a pernicious plan like killing us through environmental weapons goes unanswered and unquestioned for decades, rendering our population growthless. Black people have been at 40 million for the last 40 years, and no one is saying anything about it. And in fact, the immigrant population of Latino people has blown by us as though we aren't having any kind of reproductive activities in our lives. How did these things happen? Communities that 30 years ago were 90% net black are now 90% brown. And so sometimes when we look at an incident, we might not understand the clandestine purpose for that incident taking place in the manner that it does, or why it's important. But its importance could simply be to redirect the attention of the masses from something that is genocidal, the health of black Americans, the birth rate of black Americans, the death rate of black Americans, to something that is extravagant because of the way it happened. Does that dismiss the government? No, it makes them an even more flagrant suspect in these events, because I have never seen white actors, actresses, celebrities treated in the justice system the same way they treat black ones. I mean, and I've said this all along, Robert Downing Jr. was in and out of jail weekly. And as he went through these things, his popularity excelled. But let's talk about what has happened to black celebs. James Brown, Wesley Snipes, Michael Jackson, you name it. When they come into conflict with the justice system, they are routinely made an example of. And even if they're found innocent, they're still treated as though they're guilty.
O.J. Simpson.
I'm glad you said that.
I mean, O.J. Simpson was there in Vegas being released as this shooting happened. The media was all assembled to see O.J., try and get a glimpse of O.J., so they were all in place when this shooting happened. And O.J. was just trying to steal his own stuff back.
How do you steal your stuff?
That's what I mean. They was
Breaking
accused.
news, O.J. is out, and oh, by the way, somebody's killing everybody they can get their hands on.
Yeah. Yeah. And O.J. did what? He was in prison 9 years trying to get his own stuff back.
Ultimately find out he didn't have a gun. But the story we were sold was he marched in the hotel room and held everybody by gunpoint. See, when you look at that and you say, how long did we deliberate under the notion that O.J. was armed, that he was angry? Then at the parole board here, the very people that were in the room and he took his stuff from said, no, he talked to me very nicely. He just asked for his stuff back. And do you remember how the world was captive when O.J. was tried? Right?
Absolutely. And regardless of what anybody thinks about O.J.'s guilt or innocence, there were 12 jurors that said he was innocent. And in America, that's supposed to be enough.
Not for black people. So, to have a serious discussion about the killing or the murder or the assassination of Tupac and Biggie, you gotta get to the point where you can say conclusively, were they government players? And we've been toying with the notion that that's a possibility for 3 weeks. And I think we've reached the point now where we can say, yes. Now,
Well, both Tupac and Biggie were both being surveilled by the FBI at the time they were murdered.
and for what?
Yeah.
The question is, for what? The answer is, try to find out.
Yeah, I think it has to do with skin color.
You know what? See, when I was younger, I would have agreed with you 100%. But it's not that simple anymore.
I mean, there are a lot of, bad boy type characters, and I don't mean bad boy the record label. I mean, the Robert Downey Jr. types. Does he get surveilled by the FBI?
No.
And that's a guy who's in and out of jail. I mean, not anymore, but back then he was.
But did Robert Downey Jr. in his private life possess a messianic message to a collective group of people who has and probably will forever be targeted as or to be the second-class citizens of the United States?
Of course not.
No.
Yeah.
So it may not be as simple as color. If you look at Latinos in America, you rarely see them in a collective push to enhance their position as Americans. They might say, okay, we're going to respond to a government action that affects us. But basically, if you don't bother them, they're not going to bother you. You look at the Chinese Americans who live here, who are doing very well. In fact, the Justice Department has opened up investigations saying they're being discriminated against by the fact that they're held to higher standards by universities and colleges as relates to test scores and admittance. You don't see them running around burning stuff up and tearing stuff up, or you don't see a particular Chinese person that you could point to say, oh, he's the leader of the Chinese. No. But African Americans, because they have been in this scenario so long, from time to time, produce individuals that, by very nature of their own poverty, can only use their voice. But the voice is a very dangerous thing. The voice of a human being is a very dangerous thing. There are speeches from World War II that were given by Roosevelt and speeches that were given by the Prime Minister of Churchill that have gone down in history as the turning point of these wars because the voice is inspirational. Now, that's not something that's questionable. A messianic voice is a dangerous thing. Jesus didn't have an army, but he had a message.
And
Tupac had a voice, and Biggie had a voice. Now, do I think what Biggie was saying was liberating to black people? Absolutely not. And I can go on record, and I don't care who likes it, I detest most of the stuff that was a part of the gangster rap phenomenon. If I caught any of them treating my daughter the way that they say they treat their women, I would have went gangster on them in a real way. You do that to my daughter, I'll bust your doors down. And I'll come into your house. You won't have to worry about any sad songs singing or flower bringing, because they'll be bringing them for you. But when you talk about instruments of the destruction of black family and black culture and black values, they were that. But what happens if they turn? What happens if they change?
well, and early in Tupac's life, he had his whole thug life philosophy, and he got gangs to put down their weapons and become peaceful. That had to be very intimidating.
So their destruction could have been preemptory strikes. You know, I'm a Baptist minister, and I always lead people to the story of Jesus' nativity. The governor sent people to find him and plot his assassination before he was born. He wasn't afraid of Jesus in his physicality. He was afraid of Jesus' spirituality and the message that would come from it.
And people with power don't want to concede that power lightly.
I'll give it, Mike, absolutely. I'll give it to you like this. Well, out of all the rappers that I knew, and I knew them all, I knew Q, and I still consider him a good guy. I didn't know Dre as well. I knew Suge well. He wasn't a rapper, but I knew him well. I knew and still know Quick. The gangster rappers of that era, the one that I got to know the best and the most was Easy. And clamping Easy down in my office for 9 hours and talking to him about the legacy of the oral tradition of Africans and how it still plays a part in culture for black people, and then telling him that he was being used against that through and via his music, and watching him sit there that night and literally change in front of me, and then getting a phone call no more than a year later from the hospital requesting that I come because he's taking his last breath, taught me that when these gangster rappers, or whatever they consider themselves to be, even have a notion of producing music that is uplifting, wholesome, pro-family, pro-community, they don't do very well. And excuse anybody who hears this that might think I'm taking it lightly, but Biggie and Tupac could have simply been seen as the twofer. We'll wrap this story in a rivalry. And even though we don't want the one from New York, we'll take him because we kill presidents in America. Not only do we kill them, we kill their brothers and their friends.
And their sons.
You see? And so, I think one of the great founding fathers said, every once in a while, the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of martyrs.
I think, too, when we look at the Founding Fathers, they had an inherent distrust of the government. And it's a distrust that we need to be healthy about having today. We need to have that healthy distrust of our government. And I think that's something Tupac would agree with, were he alive and here today. And maybe that's a good place to end this.
I think the question that you just raised was a very important question. I think the capacity of a man his age to express that distrust in a manner that didn't make him a target was something that he did not possess at the time of his execution. Even now, I know better to say the things that I've always felt about America in the way I said them when I was 38, when I was 48, now that I'm 58. Because I literally have seen with my own eyes me tried, convicted, served time of a crime, being tried and convicted of the same crime. People saying, what about double jeopardy? What about it?
Yeah, it didn't apply to you. The Constitution was for everybody else, but it didn't
But the
apply to you.
slave.
Yeah.
We know now that the national anthem contains derogatory commentary about African Americans in the third and fourth verse. So, when I say to Colin Kaepernick, what you did or what you're doing is right, I would have been banging a gong for it when I was 28 and 38. But at 58, I might think this is a doomed venture. And his time might have been better spent creating economic tools in African American communities where they can hopefully control the politics and hopefully control the departments under the sway of those politicians, whereas you could get rid of racist cops. I mean, I don't know how much money he was making, but I would venture to say if you put 50 African American professional football players in the room, if each one of them put $2 million aside and created a legal defense fund to represent families who are aggrieved by police officers that kill people in their family unjustly, that might have been a better way to address the problem. I don't think people who are white and are racist hate black people as much as they hate Jews. But I don't see Jews doing the things that black people do as a response to that prejudice. They organize, they educate, they prepare and fight you in ways that are acceptable in this society. I'm certainly in support of Colin Kaepernick. But at 59, I know to be the first to do what he's doing in a racist society such as America, the owners, the politicians, and the power that be are going to do everything they can to make an example out of that young man. His assassination from pro sports is almost assured.
It's pretty much already happened. He's not on the field today.
And if you apply that to Tupac, let's just leave Biggie out the equation. He might have been politically motivated. I don't know. I never saw it, so I can't speak on it. But Tupac, I know, had political leanings and was an uncontrollable spirit. What happens to uncontrollable, controversial African American males who have the capacity to bring about change in the masses of other young black men?
They get silenced.
They get silenced. Here endeth the lesson.
Well, thank you to everybody for watching or listening to us in this podcast. This is the third episode of
Who Shot You?
Who Shot You?
Hosted by Mike Carlin and Omar Bradley for the good in the hood.